Fed Talk at the PILG.
The whole intent of the proposal to adopt the federal system is to remove and distribute some powers that are now concentrated in the hands of the Metro Manila government and spread these powers to the local government units, particularly through the adoption of the federal states, of which the local government units will be a part.
This is Fed Talk at the PILG, a friendly conversation on anything and everything federalism, with our host, Attorney Michael Henry Yusinko. Our special guest, Dr. Alex Brillantes Jr. This podcast is brought to you by Pimentel Institute for Leadership and Governance and Hans Seidel Foundation, Philippines.
Good day to all our listeners and viewers, and a warm welcome to our very special guest, Professor Alex Brillantes, one of the leading thinkers, if not the top expert in the country on decentralization and federalism. The truth is, our guest really needs no introduction. And I would say that any student or researcher of decentralization or federalism would likely have started with Professor Brillantes' papers. I know I did. Currently, Professor Brillantes is a professor of the National College of Public Administration and Governance, or NCPAG, of UP. He was a former dean, by the way, of NCPAG, and he has held many academic and other posts that are too many to mention here. I didn't mean to reveal your age, Prof. The mission of this podcast series is to understand and appreciate the Federalism Initiative in the Philippines. Many folks were actually surprised that federalism was part of the campaign platform of President Rodrigo Duterte in 2016. I still have the coffee mug that said, "No to drugs, yes to federalism." But the truth is, federalizing the country is not a new proposition. Apolinario Mabini and Jose Rizal both contemplated about this form of government as to its suitability for a young independent nation. But the person credited for bringing federalism into the public consciousness is the late Senator Nene Pimentel. In today's Fed Talk at the PILG, we discuss the legacy of the late senator as the ultimate advocate of federalism in the country. We are so fortunate to have as our guest in this podcast someone who can share a first-hand witness account on how the late senator pushed his federalism advocacy. So, Prof, let me ask first, how did your interest in decentralization and federalism start?
Well, actually, I was a student, graduate student at the University of the Philippines in the late 70s, and we were already talking about decentralization. And our dean before, Gabriel Iglesias, we were already talking about federalism because in the university, we had a center called the Center for Local and Regional Governance. It was then called the Local Government Center to deepen decentralization. It's within that context that we said, you know what, if we want to deepen decentralization, although it was kind of vague, one particular way by which it could be done is really federalism, which is what it's all about. So this was in the late 70s at the University of the Philippines with my dean, Gabriel Iglesias, and of course I worked then with Dr. Raul de Guzman and eventually Jose Abueva.
So, Prof, was your time in the UP influential in, at that time, no, sabi nyo, 1970s, was the milieu at that time very influential in your thoughts about decentralization and federalism?
Well, yes. Actually, my master's thesis was on decentralization and local governments. It was actually on the so-called Regional Development Council. I stayed and I lived in Region 2 with the then Governor D. And then we studied the impact, if you may, or the operationalization, if you may, of this thing called Regional Development Council. and how it can really localize plans, which, as you know, is very, very important component of decentralization. And as we'll discuss perhaps later, at the core of federalism. Because when we talk about federalism, it's very, very important to relate it to its ultimate ideology, which is really empowerment of subnational governments, our local governments.
So, Prof, does federalism and decentralization and federalism always go hand in hand?
Well, in the Philippine context, yes. But I know that based on our studies, well, you know this much more than I, attorney, that it not necessarily so. Where you are right now in Australia, it really goes hand in hand. But in other countries, say in maybe even in Canada, for instance, not necessarily so. There are variations of the implementation of federalism. But in the case of the Philippines, as I've said many, many times, we should define it. And for the Philippine context, I think it should go hand in hand with our discussion of decentralization and empowerment of subnational institutions, i.e. local governments, which is what democratization is all about, which is what participation is all about, which is what good governance is all about. It is an instrument to empower subnational government and the people.
So yung federalism discourse in the Philippines is not really just about yung changing the constitution.
I was a part then of the 1986 Constitutional Commission. Research assistant
Okay.
ako noon. At
Yes,
isang
yes.
malaking usapin noon ay yung parliamentary form of government. And there were some discussions also, although slightly on federalism, if you may. But of course, as you know, attorney, it all boiled down to the decentralization of local governments. I think that's in Section 10 of the Constitution. So pinag-uusapan na yan noon. And they would always connect it, if you may, to parliamentary form of government. When, if you fast forward it to our very recent 2000 recent Constitutional Commission, where Tatay was himself one of the conveners, they linked the discussion of federalism to parliamentary form of government. But of course, we should somehow delink that.
So, Prof, I like what you said, no, that federalism is at the very core is about the ideology of democratization and the empowerment of the subnational level of government. So, sa Federalism Initiative, do you think it's highlighted? Or it's more about changing constitutions or changing the form of government?
It should be highlighted. As a matter of fact, well, we were all part of this volume that was written edited by our good friend John Malaya, no? And all of us contributed there. And it was highlighted in some, at least we know we did. I think it's very, very important. I always say this, when we talk about the federalism, we frame the discourse and not be distracted by other things that can somehow derail the discussion. Maybe that has happened, I don't know. But my point is, at the end of the day, whether we change the constitution, whether we amend the local government code, hey, we're talking about the core, the ultimate objective, which is really local empowerment. That's why we said, okay, if we don't change the constitution, then hey, let's deepen decentralization. Point is, let's not lose sight of its ideology. Anong prinsipyo nito? At ito po ay empowerment. Ito po ay participation. Ito po yung enabling local governments, local institutions, the core principle that Tita Nene has always talked about to really determine their destiny. That is what autonomy, decentralization is all about. And definitely, federalism can and must deepen it. So we define it within the Philippine context. Context is very, very important.
Agree. Now, you mentioned Tatay Nene. How influential was he to you? Kasi alam ko, your name has been attached to his name for a very long time. How influential was he to you in terms of your decentralization and federalism scholarship?
I would not say even only in decentralization. I was a graduate student at the University of Hawaii from 1980 to 86. And I first read about Tatay Nene when he went to an international institution, the World Bank, and said, you know what? He was told that we cannot borrow something to that effect. And said, well, if that's the case, you guys can take your money and leave it. That was the message. And I said, my God, this guy should be president of the Philippines. So he was my idol since then. And when I came back to the Philippines in 1986, on my own, I went and visited him in his law office at the Gold Loop Towers in Pasig. Yeah. And I went and I said, sir, I'd like to work with you. And as you know, he also then authored the local government code. But I remember visiting him in his office in Gold Loop Towers because he has really influenced me because he's really a man of principle. He talks about ideology, which unfortunately, no, is not much in our political parties today, as you know. No,
Yes.
it should be at the core of our party system. And Tatay tried to do that. And of course, core in this ideology was really, hey, let's empower local governments. Hey, let's adopt a federal system of government. So Tatay has been extremely influential in my life. And as I said, for those of us who have been, I would say without being presumptuous, we were all his disciples. And I always tell that, Tatay and his ideology lives in our hearts. Not only was he a very strong nationalist, a strong advocate. I mean, come on, guys. He was imprisoned 6 times. He really paid for his dues. But equally important, what I loved about him, a man of integrity, a man of spiritualism, together, of course, with Nanay.
Prof, did you work with him with regards to decentralization and federalism
Well,
specifically?
Yes, we did. We did. Of course, the local government code. Of course, the even in the formulation of the IRR, Tatay was always been there. But I remember at one point we had the project called the GO NGO Watch, GO Government and non NGO Watch in UP, and it was published. And I was surprised that Tita Nene, whom I didn't know him then, but of course he was already very much. I just knew him quite peripherally then. Wrote a letter to the editor and commenting my work, and I was extremely humbled. Pagkatapos, I was told that when he authored the local government code in his sponsorship speech, hiyang-hiya ako kasi I was humbled because he mentioned my name when he was citing decentralization. My colleagues in UP said, hey, binanggit ka ni Senator Pimentel. Of course, I mean, who am I? I was extremely humbled. And of course, after then, we would always invite him to be our speaker. Then I became the director of the local government center of UP, and he would be always our speaker, to talk about his experiences in pushing autonomy. Nene Pimentel's name has always been equated to empowerment of local governments, empowered to the need to bring about autonomy. And because of our own ideology, personal and otherwise, we at the University of the Philippines worked with him. So yes, we participated. Then I became a director of the local government academy of UP of DILG.
DLG.
And of course, Tatay Nene was with us again, or we were with him rather. No, and he always added prestige. Not only that, he always added the necessary impact, power to our message.
How do you think Senator Nene impacted the Federalism Initiative specifically? Not just yung autonomy, but the Federalism Initiative.
Well, as you know, federalism is core in the ideology of PDP Laban, the party that he founded, and we must emphasize. And that's it. He impacted. So I thought, and I still know, that at the core of our political system should be our political parties with ideological directions, rooted, not personality. And I think that was very, very important. People say it is left-leaning. Well, what's wrong with that? It's quite radical. There's nothing wrong with that because you're talking about something that goes against the grain of traditional politics, if you may. And I think Tatay Nene's advocacy of federalism in general, beginning with autonomy, beginning with the local government code, has really influenced many of us. And it's 30 years. 30 years after the local government code, we continue to talk about that. And I must say that the president recently came out with an executive order about the Mandanas decision. I guess we'll talk about that later. But ang usapin pa rin ngayon sa Philippine administrative system is really all about devolution, autonomy. And a lot of that should be credited, and is indeed credited, to Senator Nene Pimentel.
So, Prof, you just mentioned yung Mandanas decision, which, by the way, the lawyer for Mandanas is Senator Nene in that Supreme Court case. So, talagang it's a small world. Autonomy, decentralization, and federalism is still a small world in our country, and at the center of it seems to be Senator Nene. But I just want to get your views on not the Mandanas case, because that's very clear naman, no. But in yung sinasabi yung executive order that was issued recently, Executive Order 138. Can I get some of your views about that? Is that a timely executive order, or is it too late, or how does it work?
Well, For me, yes and no. It is timely because it's about time we correct the inequities in the distribution of the resources, okay? And you and I know it has expanded the pie, so it is timely. But I'll go back to this later. Perhaps we should relook at it because of now the pandemic going on. That's something that we should look at. But to go back to that, you know what? The Mandanas decision really puts into fore the need to implement full devolution. But you know what, attorney? We've been talking about full devolution since 1991. So you're now talking about the fact that 30 years have passed and we're talking about full devolution. I was in a conversation with Galingpo colleagues. Of course, Tita Nene also started was with us in Galingpo. And
Yes.
I told them about this, that you know what, the discussion today reminds me so much of the discussions in 1991 when we're talking about transition, we're talking about full devolution, we're talking about the cost of devolution, no? And we're talking about that again. If you look at 183, that's exactly what it's talking about. It talks about the need to strengthen the capacities. So I guess we might be a devolution part 2, if you may. It is sad, but not sad. Because, hey, at least pinag-usapan natin, but it also shows you that, hey, there has been resistance to the implementation of full devolution.
And if I may ask you, Prof, what resistance are you talking about?
Well,
the same resistance as before?
Well, as you know, at the core, which is what Tita Nene said, at the core of autonomy is really decentralization of power, kapangyarihan. And you know, we are not made to give up power. We just want to keep it. So there has always been resistance to the formulation and implementation of the local government code. As you know, it was in the 1986 Constitution, right? But the code wasn't passed till 1991, 5 years. If there was no political will, giving credit to where credit is due. Tita Nene, and even, of course, Speaker Ramon Mitra at one point, and of course, the former president herself, Mrs. Aquino, if this would not come together, the code would have never been passed. But after having said that, there has been resistance. At one point, I was part of the ALG, and I've seen that. You know, even our mindsets, we always say, ay, kailangan palakasin, kailangan turuan ng mga LGUs. Sandali lang po. Bago natin sila turuan, baka tayo mismo ay dapat turuan po. For me, that has always been my ideology in the sense that, hey, we're talking about capacity building. But one emerging lesson from our experience of devolution, when we talk about capacity building, we don't only develop capacities of local, let's also develop our capacities at national. And that includes learning to let go. That includes looking at things from the perspective, the forest, and letting the implementation be done by the local government level. The problem sometimes is national government just wants and insists on doing things on its own at the national level. And hindi po sila babad lutang sila. But after having said that, the discussion of decentralization and federalism should really be located within that framework. National government, the federal government provides the broad perspective while local governments implement in accordance to the specific context. Yes, you have the framework in the framework of reinventing government, national government steers, but at the end of the day, local government rose because they know the situation at the local level. And that's what decentralization, that's what federalism, Philippine style is all about. And I've learned that in Australia, where you are right now.
Yes. So this is a nice set.
If I might say, at one point, pardon me, attorney, but this
No, go ahead, bro.
At one point, part of our job at the local government academy was to look at the good practices. So yes, we looked at Australia, we look at others in the region, including, of course, Canada. But in Australia, Tatay was the head of the delegation. And in your case, we came to study the Grants Commission. As you know, you're very familiar with the Grants Commission, how to share the monies, no?
Yes.
And Tatay came, Tatay was the head of the delegation, and Nanay and even Senator Coco came with us then to study the Grants Commission.
Yeah.
It was an excellent visit to Australia. But yes, point, when we're talking about federalism, let's look at other examples. South Africa, Canada, Germany, Australia, of course, and even Malaysia. But at the end of the day, let's come up with our own. And for us, if we come up with our own, for me, deepen it within the context of our experience over the past 30 years. So I always say, alam po ninyo, hindi bagong federalismo sa Pilipinas Kasi yan ang pinakakalaban. Oy, federalismo na, ano na naman, bago na naman. Hindi po bago yan sapagkat mas palalalimin niya po ang usapin ng decentralization and autonomy. And that is really one particular aspect that we continue to do, even if, for instance, it's not in the mainstream discussion today.
So that's great, Prof. No? And it's a nice segue to my next question, which is, what do you think are the obstacles to
Oh.
the federalism advocacy? Kasi obviously, both of us, we've been in this game for a long time. But gaya nga sinabi mo, parang hindi tayo umuusad eh. Ang usad natin is very in small increments. No? So what do you think are the fundamental obstacles to our advocacy?
Well, two things. One, we mentioned that already. No, we need to continue information dissemination. In one sense, we have to demythologize it. No, kasi hindi siya bago. Kasi usually ang kalaban ng reform is that lack of information. And we tell them, it's not new because local government code has been there. 1987 constitution has been there. Let's deepen. I think that's a fundamental, I would not say obstacle, but really a challenge. But equally important, you know what? We continue in developing the capacities, not only of local, but national governments as well. That's why institutions such as yours, institutions such as PILG, and even our own institutions are there to help in capacity building. But when we talk about capacity building, hey, let's be humble enough, national government people, pati ang kapasidad natin po, kailangan ayusin po. And part of that is changing our mindsets, changing our paradigms, and recognizing that there are a lot of good and best practices at the local level. And we've proven this to the Galing Po program, no? But of course, I will not romanticize local naman. Hindi ko sasabihin, lahat ng ginagawa nila ay okay. Hindi naman, meron mga siraulo dan, as I say. But there are also those who are good and best practices, which we have seen. Galing Po has been there for the past 24, close to 25 years now. We started 1993 with Tita Nene. Continues up to today, recognizing good and best practices at the local level. Even as we speak right now, we're now continuing the interviews for potential Galing Po winners. Why? Ang pinaka-korpo nito, empowerment, ang pinaka-korpo nito, looking for the creativity of how LGUs have used a fundamental principle. How have the local governments used the powers under the local government code to respond to the needs, including, as we speak today, the pandemic? No? At marami po dyan. We can rattle off a number of those. No? But, Marikina, you're talking about Baguio City, you're talking about Ormoc and their leaders. They're all good. And we learn from them. At the same time, national government provides the framework. So going back to the obstacle, such a long-winded answer, but going back is, it's really as one former president mentioned, parang bibingka. Niluluto sa taas, niluluto sa baba, and it becomes. So it's all about cooperation between national and local, not only one side.
So, Prof, yung federalism discourse, yung federalism advocacy, also has a transformational component, no? Particularly transforming our politics. Do you think it's happening now?
That's a very tough question because, as you said kanina, looking at our history, sometimes one is saddened. But hey, guys, we're in this together. So hindi pwedeng mag-give up, no? So actually, dalawa yung transformational attorney. One will be, yes, you're right, transforming institutions, and the local government tried to transform that, and that's done. Continuous reorganization, transforming institutions, including political parties, but equally important, transforming our mindsets. How do we bring about a change in mindset? And Tatay would always go back to not only transforming mindsets, transforming the puso. And that's where integrity comes in. Unfortunately, yan ang pinakalaban natin. But hey, we're in this together, tuloy ang laban pa rin. And as you said, umuusad tayo, but hey, we could do better. I think we could do better. And I guess that's what PILG is all about. Continuous advocacy of the ideology of Tita Nene Pimentel. Transformation, not only of structures, but transformation of our mindsets, pati na yung ating mga puso. And I know Nanay Bing has also been at the center of this when we talk about the need to transform our hearts.
Nice. So, Prof, I don't want to put you in the spot, no, but I've been asked this question a couple of times. Kasi as I said earlier, si President Duterte, one of his campaign promises was to shift to a federal system. And I've been asked many times, what happened? Ano nangyari? Why bakit hindi natuloy? So I'm going to ask you the same question. What are your views? Bakit hindi natuloy yung proposal to shift to a federal system, which also Senator Nene was deeply involved in, di ba?
Maybe it wasn't as politically expedient anymore. and maybe the way the message was conveyed by some of the people around the president became too simplistic, So maybe that's why, But if we continue, because they're part of PDP Laban, it should be rooted in that. Nasa ideology yan eh. Unfortunately, the way politics is morphing in our country today, it's again becoming more and more personality-oriented, which for me is quite sad. And you, as a political analyst yourself, I'm sure you're aware of this. But what can we do about this? I think tuloy ang laban in that sense. But maybe, I don't know if that would be the right answer, but nawala sa usapin ang federalismo kasi it wasn't as politically expedient anymore. I don't know. But I know that there's a group in the LG that has that, but they're not as active anymore. I was part of that, of course. But tuloy pa rin ang laban within the context of transforming local governments. So we go back now to the core ideology. Hey, it's all about empowerment. As I said, hindi to bago. As I said, i-deepen natin decentralization, which is what Pimentel's name is all about. And to give an example, diba, at one point, the local government code should have been reviewed and revisited every 5 years. It really did not happen, pare. So it really goes back against changing our mindsets about, guys, when we're talking about federalism, when we're talking about devolution, it's not about us. It's about improving, making services more accessible, making more services more relevant, if you may, and equally important, empowering the people. They make their own decision. That's what subsidiarity is all about. That's what empowerment is all about, which is at the core of federalism.
So this is my second to the last question, Prof. I know that you travel all over the Philippines, giving talks about decentralization and federalism. What have you noticed about the reception of the people that you talk to? Nagkakaroon ba sila ng parang realization of what federalism is all about? And then, meron bang nabubungang openness to the possibility of shifting to a federal system?
Two things. One is, like I said, it has, quote unquote, become identified with a certain political leader, right? And the president. And of course, it has become partisan. That for me could have been a downside. Okay. But that's why we always tell them, alam po ninyo, ang usapin ng federalismo ay nandyan even before, like I told you, 1979, pinag-uusapan na natin yan noon. Okay? So if we go back to its core root, okay, so going around, if you define it within the context of people empowerment, within the context of autonomy, yes, there will be. But if you say federalism, unfortunately, it has been politicized, right? And it has taken some kind of a partisan nature. So maybe let's go back. So yes, but going around the country, everybody talks about the importance of local governance. Everybody talks about the importance of innovation. Everybody talks about the importance of autonomy. And hey, we're talking about the local government code. We might have to amend it as we do now. We're talking about the mandanas. It's really deepening the discourse. And federalism is always there. So let's not lose sight of the core principle, at least Philippine style. It's really local empowerment. It's really sharpening national-local relations. And that's what you guys are doing in Australia. I know that for a fact that there can be some conflicts there between national and local, but at the end of the day, it's local that decides. And that for me is what matters. Hindi pwedeng puro national. And the pandemic, at least even in the Philippine case, has showed that. I've seen conflicts between national and local, wherein local says, sandali lang, don't do that. But national says, you do that. Local said, no, we will do that. And local prevailed. And that's what autonomy, that's what decentralization is all about. And that is what at core of federalism. So siguro po, kasi sabi mo ano mga ibang obstacles, kasi it acquired some kind of a partisan notion. Maybe let's go back to the core ideology, which is all about autonomy, strengthening subnational governments. Hey, that's what empowerment is all about. That's what democratization is all about. That's what good governance is all about.
Prof, another second to the last question, please. Kasi, of course, we know that the BARM, yung Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, is really another form of autonomy. And also, Senator Nene was also deeply involved in establishing the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao before the BARM. No? So my question is, what do you think about the prospects of a regional autonomy in the country?
Well, actually, at one point, no, in our theories, we came up with some kind of a continuum. Dati, I told you we studied RDC. Bata pa ako,
Yes, yes.
1992. We talk about deconcentration. Ang susunod po ng devolution, local autonomy, local government. Ang susunod po ng regional autonomy. And it's in the Constitution, as you know, attorney, you're an expert here. Regional autonomy for the Cordilleras and also for Mindanao. That is where we are today. And if you push the envelope further, hey, we're talking federalism. But if you want to push the envelope further, hiwalay na tayo. It will be already fragmentation, and we don't want independence naman. Okay. So we're now, federalism for me, in fact, in one of our talks with Tita Nene, we called it the logical next step to decentralization. Okay. So BARM, I think that's a great experiment because we're really responding to their needs. And hey, regional autonomy, and guess what? I'm from the Cordilleras, and the Cordilleras is now saying we should have our own regional government. No? And by the way, it's in the Constitution. So it's really towards being able to come up with more programs, projects that are responsive to our needs and not to the needs of Manila. So continue po yan, and let's just pray and hope. Hey, come on, we've been looking for political-administrative solutions to the problem in Mindanao, quote unquote. So federalism can be really to address the conflict, but equally important to bring about development. And that's what regional autonomy also about. And it's not new. 1970, pinag-usapan na po natin yan. You had the Regional Development Council. I think that's in the Integrated Reorganization Plan. The first thing that Marcos signed was PD number 1, pare IRP, integrated. And nandun yung Regional Development Council. Yun po ang core ng ating mga regional governments. So ang point ko, as quote-unquote scholars, let's build on gains. Hindi komot, kalaban sa politiko nagsulat ng itatapon na. Hindi po. And that is what an intelligent discussion is all about. And I think we saw that in the way Senator Nene Pimentel worked. No? Working with different leaders, if you may, regardless of political ideology, because we keep our eye on the ball. And the ball is ideology, the ball is federalism in this case. So,
listening to you, parang nabuhay yung paper mo na binasa ko eh. It's exactly what you wrote in your paper. Okay, this is my last question. No? What are the prospects, Prof, of the federalism advocacy after 2022? What are the prospects? And what advice can you give?
Well, for me, like I said, governance continues to evolve. And eventually, we'll eventually have to move in that direction, no? Because we cannot have a government that continues to rule from quote-unquote Imperial Manila, okay? Whether it's a federal structure, that's great. Whether it's a further devolved structure, that's great. But the prospects are, and for me, the Mandanas decision of which Tita Nene was the lawyer, really was a watershed, no? It really talks about empowering. It really talks about transferring. And I have this one of my favorite books, kay Tita Nene ito, Federalizing the Philippines. No? Buhay pa si Sir Terry Dumugho nung ginawa natin ito. My point is, we are all, like yourself, we're all traveling through life together. Whether we will see it in our lifetime, I don't know, but it is an ideology. It is an ideal. It is a vision. And the vision is a more empowered people. And if we keep our eye on the ball, then hey, the prospects, it will always be there. Like I said, pare, we've been talking about federalism ever since the 70s. But patuloy pa rin. But the point is, let's build on the hard-earned gains. Let's build on the ideologies. Let's build on the advocacies. And that's what the PILG is all about. And that's what, well, you may be in Australia, I may be in the Philippines, but tuloy ang ating laban at the end of the day, knowing for whom, and for whom, para sa mga taong bayan. And that's what Nene Pimentel was all about, living his life for other people.
Well said, Prof. And thank you for giving us your time in this podcast. We have come to the concluding portion of our podcast. And I know many of our listeners appreciate the trip back memory lane, remembering one of our greatest political leaders. And of course, one who is considered by many as the ultimate advocate of federalism. But I believe we are also lucky to hear insights from the leading expert on decentralization and federalism in the Philippines, Professor Alex Brillantes. Thank you, and till the next Fed Talk at the PILG, bye for now.
Good governance does not depend on the governors alone, but also on the governed.